a webinar series. This is session number 2. This is the feast day for Padre Pio. It's September 23rd. We'll start with an opening prayer, and then we'll dive into this afternoon's material.
Thanks, Greg. Oh, good and gracious God, we thank you that indeed you teach us how to be people of peace. We thank you that you invite us to continue to grow and to learn the skills of peacemaking, that we might be effective witnesses of your gospel message of your Son. We pray that you may bless this webinar, that it may continue to help to build a culture of peace and peacemaking. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord.
So I'm Greg Stone. I'm the author of Taming the Wolf, Peace Through Faith. And this is Father Jim Clark, who is collaborating with me on this webinar series, in which we are going through various aspects of peacemaking in a faith-based reconciliation model. We started last week with the important move from positions to interests. Okay, and then we talked about this model of how we look at satisfying others' interests and satisfying our own interests. And this gave us a tool that we could use to assess what is really happening here when we come upon a conflict situation. Let's say in the parish council, it looks like there's turf wars developing, and it may be simply different styles of addressing conflict. And so this chart helps us to start moving the parties toward collaboration. And then we added one other step, which is to look at the interest, our own interest, and the interest of the other party, or if you're acting as the facilitator or mediator, looking at the party's interest in light of the will of God. And as we move their interest more in line with the will of God, we end up with divine collaboration. So we saw that this model of aligning the parties' interests and their exercise of free will with God's will really is a model for peacemaking. When these intentions, exercise of free will, are aligned, you don't have conflict. So this is the theoretical goal that we're headed for, and this is a reason why faith-based reconciliation works better than versions that we'll find in the secular world. Now, as we start working with parties, we realize that we need to increase security and love, because we're trying to create a situation where there's safety and there's hope, and that's what will allow them to come to the table. It will generate willingness. This is an ordinary part of our faith journey, and yet it is specifically something we need to be aware of in terms of the process that we used. Last week I talked about how really the new aspect of what we're doing is we're adding process and structure to those tools that we already have within the faith. That's what we're adding. We look at this "be not afraid" or "fear not" that we hear so often in Scripture. And we look at that, and at first glance, they seem to be consoling words of consolation. And yet, when we look a little closer, we realize that fear is such an important component, such a driver of conflict, that in a way, we could take this as an admonition. If we want peace, then we need to be not afraid. So we start paying attention all the way through to the effects that fear will have on us. There's a new, once again, still working in this beginning steps of having a conceptual model that helps us understand what is it that we're dealing with, how are we going to approach this, what process are we going to use to move forward. And here's another model in which we have on the horizontal axis conflict between brother and brother, between neighbors. And so that's one axis. On the vertical axis, we have conflict with God. This is our separation with God. We see in this a model that, as I have seen, and I'm open to others' observation, but I think these two axes are linked. is when we work on reconciling relationships between brothers, between neighbors, we find people are suddenly more interested in their relationship with God, whereas that may have been impaired before. Pope Benedict XVI had a wonderful phrase here: love of neighbor is a path that leads to encounter with God, and closing to our eyes to our neighbor also blinds us to God. So it shows the importance of that path. If we're having a lot of difficulty, a lot of conflict in our life with friends, neighbors, family, it impairs our spiritual journey. And so when we're working to resolve conflict within the parish or even outside, we really are doing more than just mediation in a secular sense. We are helping people move on their spiritual journey.
You know, Greg, that reminds me of a quote by Brother Lachlan Sofield, who said that all behavior is need-directed. And it seems to me that if that's true, then it certainly underlines exactly what you're saying, that we need to get behind what is the real need behind the behavior, whether it's fear or insecurity or low self-esteem or an interest about changing a particular situation. And is this not exactly what love of neighbor is all about?
Yeah, exactly. And when we talk about conflict, we really just talk about what are the barriers to that love.
Yes.
So go on to the next here. So we look at this first step is we look at the mediator as the reconciler, working on bringing peace between brothers in the family. And this becomes, as we see this in this context, this becomes a very important part of our ministry. We see that the diagram also works in the other way, which is we cannot love the God we cannot see unless we love the God we see within ourselves and in others. So once again, this is punching this home, and this is very Franciscan in its spirituality. This is Saint Bonaventure, of course, the well-known saint from the Franciscan tradition. He was the third general minister after Francis. And we see that awareness of God within the other, the image of God. And this is an important aspect that drives our approach and our process. We see that sin separates us from God, and reconciliation heals the break. And we see this is true. Obviously, transgressions between neighbors and friends also drive that separation. And so we're working with those factors. And this starts with, the story in the Garden of Eden, where there is this division, this separation, this conflict that begins. And we don't usually, it's really interesting, we don't usually use a conflict model to talk about this, and yet it is very appropriate, because what we're doing is we are overcoming conflict.
Yes.
And so we start working on that vertical axis. And this is a very natural domain for the priest, because in Scripture we read about Christ the mediator, who seeks to reconcile us with God the Father. And so a priest takes this forward, certainly in a sacramental way, in sacramental mediation, but I think it goes further than that. And I think there's an expectation that as the priest is reconciling us with God, helping us overcome that separation, that distance, those conflicts, that we start to depend upon a priest. And I tell priests usually, you're a mediator already. And there's a little bit of a surprise, but then it's like, no, this is perhaps an unstated expectation of parishioners. They expect a priest to help them make peace, and when this unstated expectation is disappointed, you get conflict within the parish.
You're absolutely right, and the people certainly have the right expectation, because this is the heart of a priestly spirituality, the whole idea of bringing together oppositional tendencies or differences. For example, heaven and earth, polarities, male and female, sacrifice and meal. The work of being a priest is just that. And this mediation of the opposites is what brings about authentic union.
Right, exactly. And so we can see the process includes that. Pope Benedict XVI made a very important observation for this particular type of work. If I have no contact whatsoever with God in my life, then I cannot see in the other anything more than the other. And I am incapable of seeing in him the image of God. This is a statement of our culture at this time. And we see as the culture drifts away from faith and cannot see the image of God in the other, that we do have this increase of conflict, violence, and so forth. In the homily that Benedict XVI gave on 8th of December 2005, I just wanted to read this because he takes this up in such a beautiful manner. He states in that homily, "We live in the right way if we live in accordance with the truth of our being, and that is in accordance with God's will," which is what we've been talking about. "For God's will is not a law for the human being imposed from the outside that constrains him, but the intrinsic measure of his nature, a measure that is engraved within him and makes him the image of God, hence a free creature. If we live in opposition to love and against the truth, in opposition to God, then we destroy one another and we destroy the world." I think that is so captures what we see in the world, in the troubling events that are taking place. And there is this move away. And on the other hand, I think the upside is this gives us an entry point. Yes. I think we can go into the culture and as a church become an instrument of peace. When we say this is what we address, and I think people will come toward the church on that basis.
Absolutely. And healthy spirituality is always about honoring the context, and perhaps more than any other time in history, this is a time where the model of church as peacemaker, and certainly as lived out in the witness, the public witness and presence of its clergy, is essential if we're going to move forward in trying to have an effect on the secular culture.
Yes, exactly. In the next slide, we talk about see the divine in the other. That's what we've been talking about, seeing the image of God in the other. This is a very Franciscan concept. Francis saw the divine in all creatures, and this really gives us so much of the charism of the Franciscan approach to this work. So we're back at this model, and so this is a model that, it's interesting, we look at, well, the world may dispute this. They may say, well, I'm not sure that I need the faith in order to reconcile. But when you look at this from a theological viewpoint, from a sociological viewpoint, from an anthropological viewpoint, it turns out that that isn't really the case. Because, and the reason this is true is because when you exclude God, you exclude a part of reality, you exclude the truth, and now suddenly you're limping along in a world with only half of the information, half of the tools, half of reality. And so, in a sense, this is our task at this point, is to be aware of this model and realize that what we're doing is not only going forth and creating peace among brothers, but we're introducing people to a deeper reality, and which will bring true peace, the peace of Christ. Shifting now to a practical aspect, is we start to look at, okay, what do we have to do to bring people to the table? Okay, and we've talked before about assessing interests, and we've listened to people on their interests. We've asked them to, tell us what happened, share their story. And typically as a mediator, the story that you've heard, and you want it this way, you want them to tell the story in their own words, but at the end of that period, you have a lot of detail. You have this story. And now what you're looking to do, you're looking to listen so that you can assess this story in a more precise manner. And one tool, this is only one tool, is to assess it in terms of be, do, and have. So we're boiling down, and we want to find out, we want to talk to the parties in conflict and ask them, what do you want to be that has been opposed? Now, we might not state it in that way. None of these processes are rote. There's something that you've gained skill with over time. But basically, you're looking at it and you're going, what does this person want to be that someone is stopping them from being? Or they may be the party that is frightened and doesn't want someone to be something. This area of what do you want to be, this is identity conflicts, which is what we see usually in the world of faith-based conflict in the Middle East and so forth. There's people have different ideas of what is the essence of man. Mm-hmm. Who are we really? Mm-hmm. And who they want to be allowed to be. And this can go down to subtle aspects. Someone may want to be in a particular position, a job. Mm-hmm. Or it may be internal, where they want to be respected for who it is that they see themselves. They're creating their life, and they're creating this character that they are. And this is a very sensitive area. Often people won't even bring this up. They feel it's too ego-based. But as a mediator, you're watching, because to bring them to the table, you may want to have, what will help you is an insight. And to say, well, you know, in this particular situation, I can see that you really want to be respected for your skills in storytelling or whatever it may be. I see that you really want to be respected as an associate priest. And you want to be recognized for the unique skills that you have. And I understand that maybe there's some opposition to that. And typically when you get it correct, there'll be this moment of hope. Oh, somebody gets me. Okay, it is possible for me to work through this because someone does understand what I need. Same with do. You know, freedom. What is the person trying to do that someone is stopping? And so it's finding out in what ways do they feel that their freedom is constrained, and looking at that. And this can go in many different, all the areas of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, all the freedoms that we hold dear. But you start to look at this and see, okay, where do they feel that they're being opposed? And then you take that up. Now, once again, these things are getting the person to the table. Now, in the mediation process, you may take them up again and say, okay, well, we have a teenager, okay, and he wants to, his parents want him home at 11 o'clock. He's got a curfew. And what he wants to do is stay out. Now, so we're debating there, okay, what can you do and who decides? Who decides the norms, the rules? Who decides the morals? And that becomes part of the conflict resolution process. But initially, if you can just indicate this in a very precise way, you'll get that feeling of hope, and someone will come to the table. Now, in that case with the teenager, we can sometimes read these wrong. We can think that that's what he wanted to do, and we can negotiate on that basis. And it turns out that, no, the reason that he wants to stay out has to do more with being. He wants to be seen as an adult. And not having a curfew is a recognition of your being as an adult. That may be it. So there may be a different solution. So once you work through this, you can usually find where it's stuck. Same with what do you want to have that's been opposed. And these become very malleable. They're, sometimes They are linked, they're interdependent. Sometimes we go to work in order to have money, in order to buy something that contributes to our being, how people see us, our self-image. And so you can work these, and part of that skill in working these is understanding what's really at stake here. Like, you may have an employee and you think that, okay, this is the end of the road, he wants to be paid more. And so based on that assumption, you may not resolve his future employment with you. If you had sat down and inquired further, it turns out, yeah, he'd like to get paid more, but he realizes the company can't afford it. So he would rather, in exchange, instead, have increased status. So it may be appointing him to a higher position. So there's all the ways that you work with these variables to find out what is it that most touches them. How do they see this conflict? And that will start to move them to the table.
Yeah.
Now, in this area, we have, next slide, the 4 things that St. Francis would stay away from. This really guided his life. Is he would eschew power, prestige, possessions, and pride. And you see that these are various areas of be, do, and have. And he saw these variables as destroying relationships.
Yes.
And so he would make a point of not trying to exert power or have prestige. And this is where you get into the idea of Franciscan humility. Possessions, Franciscan poverty. And so we look at these, and we may not take the vow of poverty. We may not be a Franciscan in terms of taking that role of humility. However, it still is at work in our life. Mm-hmm. And so we can learn from St. Francis how to avoid these areas. And as a mediator, you can look at this and see, okay, is there an issue of power that's a little bit out of line? Okay, do they have a need here that maybe could be addressed in a different way? Mm-hmm. Something that they need to explore in more detail. So those are ones to look and assess. Now, most of the time we find, when we come upon the scene, we find impasse. This is where we find the parties. They're stuck. It's like they're stuck in flypaper or quicksand, and they can't move. We have this 2 people in a stance, they're locked. And so when we see that and there's no movement, that becomes the challenge of convening. And convening is getting them to the table. Let's go to the next slide here. Is getting them to the table. And we talked about this a little bit last week. We touched on it, and now we look at it a little bit more. Sometimes just getting people to the table is more difficult than the actual mediation.
Agreed.
So what we want to do is look at, okay, what is it that stands between us and convening a conciliatory process? It may be a conversation that's facilitated. It may be a mediation. It may be another process, but you want to get them to the table. And you'll see that as you're assessing this and looking at what's going to bring them to the table, you're starting to walk into the areas, the drivers of conflict. But at this point, you're not trying to resolve the matter. What you're trying to do is indicate to the person, I think this is about, and indicate it. And what you've done is at that first level, created a situation in which they can go to the table. One of the primary barriers has to do with expectations, particularly disappointed expectations. We find people who are in conflict feel that they've been disappointed. Now, obviously, like a contract is a formal document that lays out expectations, but most of the time they're less formal. And sometimes we we go too fast when we set expectations, and there becomes a mismatch between two people in terms of what's expected. And it gets worse when we find that there's a lot of unstated expectations, where people hold, this is the way it should be. Now we can find this a lot with the church, where people have an expectation, this is how it should be. But I'm not seeing what I expect. And so when those remain unstated, they don't get handled. We just find people are out of sorts. So, and we even find this is an interesting area, is if you get into, this is where spiritual direction and retreats come in, it's kind of interesting to find out what are the unstated expectations people have of God.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and you get into areas like, you know, the problem of suffering. You get into these areas where, you know, maybe someone has built up over a lifetime of their faith journey certain unstated expectations. And as a spiritual director, as a priest, you may not understand what's happened. Why are they having such a difficult time? And it's something unstated. And so what we need to do is we start exploring these and finding out what are these expectations that are unstated.
Sometimes those unstated expectations are unreal, or they're not based in the reality of the other parties, and can cause even more of a discomfiture and difficulty to reach some sort of understanding of the other party.
Right. And often you'll start a mediation, and you'll finally get to the point where the party is able to express why they're upset, and the other party may have never realized there was an expectation. You find this in domestic cases a lot, where there's just a given, this is what a marriage is like, and this is what I expect from a wife or a husband, and they've never been stated. And once you get them out on the table, now creativity is possible, and you can start using those. But be very aware of what are the expectations at work. Another area that's very subtle and that can block getting to the table has to do with this area of right and wrong, and someone being made wrong. We overlook this. I know I do this. This is a personal shortcoming of my own, is I tend to sometimes be a little brusque, moving a little bit fast, definitely willing to debate at the drop of a hat.
Oh, yes.
And so what happens sometimes is you end up making someone wrong.
Yes.
And you maybe overlook it. And you may think, well, that was such a minor thing. Let's say that the parish secretary, she typed up a letter, and it maybe wasn't the form that the pastor wanted. And it's a very simple thing to, like, you know, can you put this in the form that we usually use? Well, there may be, in terms of body language, in terms of the assignment, there may be the sense that I've been made wrong. And we think, well, but that's such a small thing. Why would that develop into a huge conflict? And part of the reason is that we start to equate right and wrong with survival. The example I use in the book is, if you're driving a car and you're heading towards this cliff, this drop off, and you estimate or know the braking capability of the car, and you're right, well, you survive. If you're wrong, you go off the cliff and you don't survive. And we start to unconsciously build this into, so that when we're made wrong, our survival is threatened. And some people will go like, well, why are you so upset? You're treating this like it's a life and death matter. Well, it is at an unconscious level. So this is something that's very simple that you can do to get someone to the table. It's just a simple question of, like, you know, in this situation, did someone make you wrong? Did someone show you disrespect and tell you were wrong, that you didn't know? Boom. If you hit that, the emotions that come off it are huge.
Those are good questions.
And it clears the way. It clears the way to go forward. Speaking of emotions, this is, when we're listening to the party story, there's of course the what happened story, and then there's also the feelings story, and this is the emotions, and we don't want to take these out of the story. We're not trying to get to a story that has no emotions or no feelings, but we do want to understand the emotions because they color the story. They color the perceptions of what's happened.
I understand also that emotions, especially negative emotions, are contagious. That whether it's between two or two parties, that the primary emotion often gets picked up at an intuitive level and becomes expanded in the midst of the gathering to such a degree that sometimes it can really throw the mediator off unless he or she is willing to look again at what's the real issue underneath the behavior.
Yeah, in fact, that's on the next slide. That's where we take that issue up, is the idea of destructive emotions. Yeah. In other words, fear, rage, anger. These are the emotions that tend to be destructive. And we tend to, it's interesting, we tend to start describing the other party in terms of our fear of the consequences of those emotions. And these emotions tend to block reason. And so we know at the point that we get into destructive emotions, most likely we're going to hit faulty perception.
Yes.
Okay. And the thing that we can do here is a reality check.
Yeah.
And a good question to ask as we go along. I mean, obviously, even in St. Paul, we, look at, through a glass darkly. Yeah. And that's kind of what's happening here. Those emotions are causing these filters that alter reality. Now, a mediator may be able to see that. A mediator may be able to see, whoa, they're not tracking. How they're seeing the world. The reality that they're seeing is not what other people are seeing. And yet, this is where caution is really due. You don't want to make them wrong for that, but you want to give them the opportunity to do reality checks. Yeah. And so a frequent question that you're asking as you're listening to the story and they're telling is, how does it seem to you now? Yeah. So you're allowing the venting to take place, and then you're checking that reality. What does it look like to you now?
That's good.
And we can, that passage in Scripture where it talks about, as the world sees it. Well, we know that we're trying to go beyond that. Yeah. So the kinds of perceptual errors you might get into are, the situation was perceived inaccurately. I just made a mistake. I didn't understand what you wanted. I didn't understand what you were trying to do. I didn't understand the meaning of what you said to me. I took insult, and now I realize I just perceived that incorrectly. Yeah. That's a big one. And before you get to the table, you may just be asking the question, is it possible, could it be possible that you've misperceived the situation? And most people will say, well, yeah, I've done that. So it has happened. And then one thing that will draw people to the table, would you like an opportunity to check, to see? And that's another way.
It's a very respectful way.
Yeah, and that's what you're doing. As you're listening to the story, you're understanding its reality as they saw it, but that doesn't mean that they can't redraft it. If you're in an adversarial mode, if you're in court and you're litigating, they're going to hang on to their story. Oh, yeah. Whereas in this kind of process, you allow them to change. You allow them to engage in reality checks. Another way that we get perception is through our prejudices or our biases. Yeah. And so those can be simple questions, asking if when we came to this situation, did we have a feeling about how it might be? What did we expect might happen? What is there about the other person that maybe precipitated this? And now you start to get the prejudices and biases out. Yeah. A key one, which we're going to go into detail in next week, is false attributions. False attributions are a key conflict driver, and just to define that shortly at this point, we can go into it more next week. is basically we write our own story. We wear the white hat. We understand how situation forces us into situations in which we commit transgressions.
Yeah.
But we basically know that we still wear the white hat. Whereas the other guy, when he commits a transgression, we attribute, here's where it's false attribution, we attribute negative disposition, bad character. And so we write his story.
Yeah.
We write his inner story. Oh, here's what he was thinking. He was out to get me. That's a false attribution.
So we can lump it all together into one category or one overall symptom.
Yeah. And that's the other party's inner story is assumed.
Okay.
And that's a question that will get you to the table is, are you certain that you know what the other party was thinking?
Yeah, exactly.
Are you really certain that you know? And very rarely will someone make that blanket statement, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
You know, and you're like, well, how would you know? And you pursue that. Emotional attachments, color perception, senses were impaired. This is an important ethical consideration. What if you're working with someone who is under the influence of alcohol, drugs, or
good question,
trauma, mental illness?
Yep.
This kind of process is very self-determinism plays a big role. So if a party is unable to make a self-determined decision, as a mediator, you have an ethical duty to go, I don't know if they can make a decision. And so you need to guide them maybe to handling that situation.
Makes sense.
Now these negative, destructive emotions and so forth that have created these perceptual problems also create walls. And there's really two basic kinds of walls. There's the wall to keep the other guy out.
Yeah.
The wall of fear.
Right.
I'm afraid, I need a wall, so I'm safe. The other kind of wall that we often overlook is the wall that keeps us from harming the other.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
Keeps us inside. So we may be suffering with some kind of, with feelings of hostility, and we may fear that we're likely to transgress, and so we block ourselves from that.
Yeah.
So it could be either way.
It's a very apt metaphor, that's for sure.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that we need to realize in mediation is we're not about tearing down walls. That's not the job of a mediator. What we do is build bridges.
Okay.
Is if we start to tear down walls, maybe those are walls that are needed.
Yeah.
And so we risk venturing then into areas that may create more harm than the good we do. So we want to look at, okay, how do we build the bridge? How do we overcome that fear? How do we overcome that anger? And how do we build a very precise bridge that allows the parties to meet on that bridge?
So transforming walls into bridges, I love that image. It really is a hard work, but a necessary work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's what you really are looking at is, okay, what materials do I have? Can I get from the parties that will allow me to build this wall? Desire for revenge. This can be a major block to convening. It's like, no, they want to get even.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm not going to sit down with that person. You know, I have my own way. Don't worry, this is going to get squared away.
Exactly.
And so you have that, which you have an overt expression of a desire for revenge.
Yeah.
And in other cases, though, you have people who that feeling of revenge doesn't feel good, and so they suppress it.
Yeah.
So they may have fantasies about, boy, it would be really, wow, if lightning would strike him, I would feel pretty good. And they look at these little ideas of revenge, and then they feel bad.
Yeah.
They feel like, you know, I'm wishing bad things for them, and yet it keeps haunting them. So we get this area of revenge, which is a huge area, and the one thing that I think helps us move, this is like a wall into a bridge, move, is to understand what is revenge really. Okay. It's enforced empathy.
Oh, okay.
When you an act of revenge is really saying, I want you to feel the hurt that I felt.
Okay.
It's kind of a funny empathy, but it's enforced empathy. Okay, I'll feel okay when you feel the pain I felt, when you know how I hurt.
Yeah.
Then, and when you can phrase it in that way, suddenly it changes the nature of revenge.
Yes, absolutely.
And it may bring them to the table. Because you may say, well, would you like an opportunity to tell them how you really hurt? Well, yeah. And suddenly that you shift from the desire to hurt the other to that underlying desire, which is I really want them to know. I want them to know how I hurt. Yeah. And so that's one way of moving them that way. Narcissism. It's so common today. You know, why should I sit down with that other person, you know?
Yeah.
You know, and I'm just interested. I don't care I don't care that they're upset, you know, and it's all about your interest. Now, one way that you work with that at this level is to let them see that if the other party feels that you're helping them satisfy their interests, they'll help you. So it's not an ideal solution, but initially it's very pragmatic. It has utility. Okay. Yeah. Here's how. Okay, you're interested. You have a self-interest here. This is maybe your best way to deal with it.
Good insight.
Yeah. Spiritual direction is such a huge part of this, and this is something that you may want to comment on, because I think when we approach mediation in this way as a spirit-driven process, as faith-based reconciliation, there are times when the mediation process needs, and this is common in mediation, needs a timeout. And that timeout is for reflection. That timeout is to let things cool. A really key part of that can be spiritual direction. Yeah. And I've had that situation happen where I could see a party was struggling, and they were struggling with who they had become in the fight. Okay, so they had a valid interest. Okay, their needs were valid, and yet over the course of the conflict, they had done things, said things, taken points of view that left them not feeling good about themselves. Yeah. In other words, they didn't enter it knowing how to fight good, how to engage in combat in an ethical and spiritual manner. So at that point, when I would see that, I would recommend, I say, you know, before we meet again next week, would it be possible to meet with a spiritual director?
Yeah, well said.
A week later, all of that burden gone, happy to pursue their interests.
Well, it makes sense to me, because spiritual direction is about changing from the inside out, where mediation is changing from the outside in, and obviously they can interact at different layers of that, but that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, one feeds into the other and supports the other.
Yeah. And there's times when you can see someone is really, they're stuck.
Yes.
They are stuck. And what's missing is that reconciliation on the vertical axis, reconciliation with God. I had one situation, mediators don't usually work in the criminal aspect of things because you don't enjoy the same confidentiality.
Right.
In civil proceedings, I enjoy total confidentiality. The judge can call you in and say, I really want to know what the parties were talking about. And it's like, no, Your Honor, I can't say a word. And the Supreme Court's backed it up. So that's ironclad. The value of confidentiality to bring about candor is highly valuable.
Absolutely, yeah.
When you get into the criminal area, there are no statutes that protect you in that way. You can go become an employee of the attorney and go under that umbrella. But so I had a situation like that where it was a criminal case, and I saw that what was hung up was this person's inability to really grapple with an examination of the conscience. And that if this person could grapple with that, I felt there would be such a transformation that their appearance before the court and so forth would be totally changed, and the outcome would be changed.
Yeah.
And I had a really difficult time choreographing that because it's not something that's been set up.
Yeah.
All I could do is recommend, and I would talk to the priest at the parish and say, as much as you can invite a rite of reconciliation, that helps.
Yeah.
But in that situation, you're not in that deeper spiritual direction where you can pursue it a little deeper.
Yeah. Well, this really is a work of transformation. I think that's exactly what we're talking about, is moving from an immature or false self to more of a divine self, because this work truly is helping a person become whole in Christ, or a community, whether it's a community of two or more, really seeing that it's a work of bringing all the disparate parts of a personal relationship together through these methods of peacemaking.
Yes.
So it's not power from above, but it's power from within and between, which is a very different concept and practice.
Right, right. And it's not power from above in terms of the litigation law,
Yes, exactly.
in terms of verdicts, in terms of that. It is power from above in the sense that the Holy Spirit guides us through this process.
Yes.
But what we see with the false self, I mean, you hear people in conflict always say, well, I just wasn't myself.
Yes.
I don't know why I did that. It wasn't really me. I'm sorry. And you start to see that what's really engaged in conflict is the false self.
Yes.
It's these ego selves. It's something other than the image of God.
Yeah.
And so this becomes really the key model of what we're doing here is basically we have two false selves that are locked into conflict.
Yeah.
And neither of those false selves represent the image of God within the person.
Yeah.
And so as a participant, as a party in a conflict, what we're trying to do is step outside of and around that false self. And that's where spiritual direction comes in.
Yeah.
In the process is, how do I step out of this identity? Once again, the need to be. How do I step outside of this identity that I've created that has all of these booby traps that set me up for conflict with my brother, that set me up for conflict with God? How do I step aside from that, step outside of that false self, and really see the other from within as the image of God, and step past their false self?
Yeah, makes sense.
Because it's their false self, it's antagonizing us.
Yeah.
And can we go around that and see the image of God? And this is the dance. This is really the dance that a mediator is choreographing.
Well, it seems to me you really do need this expert gift of mediator to help, because this is where people can slip into speaking or fighting from the shadow or the compulsive self rather than the authentic self. And I can see the wisdom of bringing in spiritual direction to the whole process, and where priests can be very, very helpful in bringing about, an authentic, lasting peace.
Yeah. As accompanying this session today, there's a link to a series of quotes. It's like 17 pages of quotes regarding the false self. This is from Merton, from Pope Benedict XVI, from Paul, from St. Paul, the passage that we know so well from Romans 7, which really captures, that passage in Scripture captures this problem of the false self. And there's a number of other writers who've dealt with this, and so that's available as an attachment to this. There's some beautiful quotes from Benedict XVI quoting St. Bonaventure.
Oh, all right.
And he talks about what we're really dealing with as we make this journey is, as a sculptor, we're chipping away all of those things that are false.
Yeah.
And that this is the process that we're engaged in. And basically, as Adam, we're covered in all this filth and dross, and we have to chip it off. And that's very key for mediation, is what we're doing is we're providing an opportunity for a person to look at how do those things, how do they affect me in the real world?
Yeah.
And how do they affect the other? And so, in a way, conflict resolution becomes applied spiritual direction.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to say it. I think one of the difficulties that a lot of us men have is the whole idea of the fear of being vulnerable. Because to truly have an authentic conversation means at some point I have to be in touch not with my feelings and my thoughts, but my value system. And if I'm being small-minded or I'm operating out of my false self, I'm going to do my darndest to try and protect that. And so I think, like you said earlier, about getting behind the false self and doing a dance around it is essential if we're going to find any type of mutual satisfaction.
Yeah. And we see this with the culture.
Absolutely.
The culture drives images of a self that you need to be, a self you need to protect, and they're false selves.
Yeah.
And so we end up with a culture in which everyone's protecting these identities that are really destructive in the end.
Mm-hmm.
So we start we start going through this process, and as we're moving toward the table, we're asking the parties to start. We've dealt with emotions, we've dealt with essentially worldly desires along the way. We've started stripping this away, getting closer to the will of God. And this is where we bring reason in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if we were to settle this, what criteria?
Yeah.
What are the criteria for a decent settlement? And we start to engage reason. I reread this weekend the Regensburg Address by Benedict, which caused so much upset. And that really was the core of that address, was saying we as Catholics believe that God has endowed us with reason, and reason can play a role. And that viewpoint was contrasted with faith situations in which reason was discounted, in which God could be capricious. And it's very interesting. And so in this process, we start to tap into that part of our endowment, reason, and okay, what would a reasoned settlement look like? What are the criteria? How do we measure success? This is a big one. You know, as a mediator, it can't be our measure of success, because then we add our bias to it. So satisfaction has become the measure of how is this working. And there's this three-legged triangle in which we look at the substance. What does the final agreement look like? Did it meet the needs of the parties? Psychological satisfaction. Was I respected? Mm-hmm. Was I treated okay? Mm-hmm. Procedural satisfaction. Was this a fair process? Did it treat everyone in a fair manner? And those are the three areas in which you'll find, and you keep those in mind as you're beginning this process and through it, is these are the things that determine whether it's a success. Mm-hmm. Now we get into an area that we'll take up in later, but I wanted to introduce this at this point, because sometimes in convening you might run into this and you might give up. You might say, no, this is too difficult. And that's where you start to see, as you
Mr. Stone and Father Clark seem to be having some technical difficulties right now. I'm sure they're working on it. They've lost both audio and video. His server just timed out. I see Father David is typing a message. Oh, yes. They term out at the most inconvenient times. By the way, they are on slide 38 of 42, so fortunately they are well into the presentation. I will also take this opportunity to tell you that, well, since I'm talking to you, you might as well see me. This presentation is available to you on the Attachments tab, which is the fourth icon over. Looks like a large TV screen. This presentation is being recorded, still recorded. We hope Mr. Stone and Father Clark rejoin us soon. We will keep going until 2:30. Again, the recording will be posted online. Please use the chat box if you have any other comments. I have muted all of the other microphones, but I'm going to go off video and mute back again and see if I can contact Mr. Stone on the phone. Again, I'll be here till 2:30 and farther. Oh, he's just ringing me up now. Mr. Stone has said he will pick up the rest of this at next week's session, since there's only 4 more slides left. So I will be stopping the recording right now. Thank you.